Welcome to Raytown Chop Shop.
This is part 3 of the KawaBunga build, and this is my first car.
It didn't always look like this. I trailered it home when Austin was 9. When he was 10, he took his first ride in it, much to the dismay of his mother, who was watching from the front porch. All turned out well, though. It took 7 years to build it, and I finished it just in time to give it to Austin on his 16th birthday.
But today is all about the KawaBunga, so come join us.
The new wheels and tires are taller and wider than the originals, and they hit the frame when you turn too far. We know we're going to have to modify the front axle, so off come the tie rods.
We're not going to use a standard steering wheel, so Dad used the plasma cutter to remove the old steering system. I bought new sheet metal for the KawaBunga, so I used the air chisel to cut off the old belly pan.
Somebody goofed up and didn't take video of us cutting the go-kart in half, but it was pretty standard stuff. With the go-kart in 2 pieces, Austin and Chris swing the engine into place on the rear half of the go-kart.
Once we had it lined up, we installed and tightened the engine mounting bolts. Here's where the fun begins. It's time to find out how long the KawaBunga needs to be. I placed the seat approximately 6 inches from the radiator so we could get some air flowing to it.
With the seat in place, Austin got into driving position. From this, we determined the extension tubes needed to be 40 inches long. I gave Chris the job of cleaning up the inside and outside of the tubes after we sawed them off.
We're going to put solid steel plugs inside each of the connecting tubes when we lengthen the go-kart, so Dad cut holes in the ends of each of the tubes that I can weld the plugs inside of them. I marked where he needed to cut the weld holes in the tubes.
Notice I'm the one doing all the menial tasks on this build. Now the boys are doing all the technical stuff. Seems the roles are reversed from where they were 15 years ago. I finished cutting all the weld holes in the tubes.
I turned down the solid steel plugs on the lathe. Each plug slides in 1.5 inches, leaving another 1.5 inches that will go inside the new extensions. With the plugs installed, I welded them in place through the holes my dad cut earlier in the tubes.
The moment of truth has arrived. It took 3 of us to align the 4 tubes that connect the back half of the go-kart with the front half.
A few blows of the hammer and the tubes slide completely over the plugs.
Before we welded the tubes together, we used a length of string to check the alignment of all the tubes. With the string taped on each end of the go-kart along the bottom rail, we can now move the tubes until they're aligned left and right and up and down.
Once the rails were aligned, I tack welded the old tubes to the new tubes.
Austin drew up a diagram of the roll bars that are going to go on the KawaBunga, complete with dimensions and angle measurements. Chris and I placed the first tube in the bender, making sure the center of the bend was aligned with the center of the die. A few pumps on the bottle jack, and the tube began to bend. In order to make sure we bend the tube to the correct angle that Austin drew up, we cut a 45-degree angle out of cardboard, and Chris held it up to the bent tube to see how close we were. 4 bends later, and we have the general shape of the main roll bar. Austin used a tape measure to see if the legs of the roll bar are the same width as the outside rails on the go-kart. We got the width close on the bender, but had to resort to manual manipulation to get it exactly right. Notice how the bar rebounds after spreading the ends apart. It took a few more tries to get it exact.
The bends were perfect. The width was perfect. The height, not so much. Back to the drawing board. While Dad and the Smith brothers worked on the roll bar, I got to work widening the front axle. I took off the front spindles, I cut a square tube to make the extensions for the front axle, I sawed off the original front axle ends, and inserted them into the larger square tube I cut earlier and welded the two together. I slid the new ends on the original front axle and welded them solid. One of the steering arms was bent and the geometry on the unbent arm wouldn't work with the wider wheels and tires, so I cut, bent, and reshaped them to match the already bent arm. I made sure the two of them were at the correct length and angle and welded the one I had cut. I put on the new spindles, wheels, and tires. I reinstalled the original tie rods to make sure the heim joints cleared the inside of the wheel.
We knew from the very beginning of this build that the Kawasaki chain was going to be way too long once we installed the engine on the go-kart, so it came time to shorten it. Austin had ordered a motorcycle chain removal and installation tool for the '78 Honda we're restoring. Well, now was his chance to see if it really worked. Surprisingly, he read the instructions on how to use the tool. So proud of him.
Yes, I read the instructions. Looks like it's going to work perfectly.
And here's how much of the original Kawasaki chain Austin cut off. And here's what the chain looks like now.
With the chain in place, it's time to align the sprocket and engine. We took a lot of measurements to make sure everything lined up, front to back, side to side. The hard part was trying to find symmetrical points on the motorcycle to measure from. Once we had the correct sprocket and engine alignment and the correct chain tension, I tightened up the engine mounting bolts and we rechecked our measurements.
We had a pretty good idea that we were going to try to start the engine, so Austin put the exhaust back on, 1, to cut down on the noise, and 2, to keep the head from overheating and warping. Big moment here, folks. With the rear end off the ground, a little gas in the tank, and a fully charged battery, it's time to fire this thing up.
I was anxious to see if the chain was going to work, so I pulled in the clutch and shifted into first, and it died.
For those of you who ride motorcycles, you know they won't start in gear or run if the kickstand is down. Since we'd taken ours off, we had to jump the 2 wires of the safety switch.
Take 2. I pulled in the clutch and shifted it into first. and the back wheels started spinning. Since bikes have what's called a wet clutch, the wet being oil, there's always friction even with the clutch in, which is just enough friction to turn the wheels. I overcame the friction by holding the tire with my hand. I let the clutch out and let it idle for a second to make sure the chain wouldn't fly off. Once I was sure that wasn't going to happen, I gave it a little gas. Now I'm really getting anxious to drive this thing.
Since we're going to cut off the back end of the motorcycle frame, Austin did some fabricating to mount all the relays that are now just hanging down.
Before they closed down Kansas City International Raceway in 2012, my kids faced off on the drag strip. My daughter Lauren's 56 Chevy versus Austin's 54 Ford. We're not going to talk about who won and who lost. Okay, loser, it's your turn to talk.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for watching part 3 of the KawaBunga build. We've accomplished a lot, but we still have a long way to go. On the next episode, we'll finally install the seat, fabricate a rear brake mount, and install the rear monoshock. Thanks for watching.